Hey, everybody, welcome back. You're listening to the Origination Point podcast. My name is Bill De La Cruz, and as you know, this idea of the Origination Point is just really talking about the issues that are impacting us and really looking at how our biases, how our judgments, how our stereotypes, our diversity, all of the things that make us who we are, how they impact how we see each other. And it's been a really interesting journey. I think this is our over 50th episode, and we've talked about a whole variety of topics and racial issues. And I've had guests on that have shared their stories. And today I'm really excited. I have Tracey Benson on with us today, who's also a fellow practitioner. So, someone who is really entrenched in the work. And I actually met Tracey through some webinars that he's done. And I'm really excited because we're going to just have a real conversation from our lens of practitioners about how we see this work, some of the things that are happening currently, both from a political perspective and in organizations and companies. And so, um, really excited. So, Tracey, welcome. Really, really glad to have you here, and welcome. Glad you got through those crazy snowstorms out east.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Bill. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you reaching out and for us connecting because it's not very often, as a equity broader term practitioner, I don't often get to talk with other folks unless I'm an official partnership with a contract. But these conversations often don't happen for me with other practitioners and then also happen on a podcast, right? So I'm excited to use this
Yeah.
for my podcast as well, the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute podcast. So folks get to hear two folks who are in this work who have similarities and differences in how we approach the work. And just a little bit about me, I'm a career educator. I started out as a pre-K teacher. Um, I did that for a very short stint, when I was in my teaching my teaching preparation program, and I decided that pre-K is not for me, and I quickly transitioned to fourth grade, and that's why I did the bulk of my teaching in fourth grade math and science. Loved it, still love teaching math and science to elementary school kids, and when I'm done with this whole consulting gig, I'm going to go back and end up in my education career in a fourth grade classroom. That's my dream,
Nice.
right? To go back and be close, really close to the kids that I love to teach. Um, while I was teaching, I saw, a lot of things that happened in terms of education. I come from a family of educators. My father was a special ed teacher. My mother was a counselor in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in Milwaukee public
Yeah.
schools, right? They remained there, they stayed there, and they were very strong advocates for it. They didn't call it anti-racism. They didn't call it DEI. They just called it what's good for kids and what's good for our neighborhood. Um, and so I had that sort of epistemology to understanding of my role as the educator that came very strongly from my parents. But as I was teaching, I would do sort of leadership activities amongst our team and our principal at the time. Um, oh, okay, there we
Oops.
go. Our principal at the time suggested that I might want to think about administration. I was like, okay, I'll try it out. Right? I'm a young guy. I'll try it out. Let me go back and get my master's in school administration. So I went back just on a whim and became an AP at a middle school and really began to love it because I'm a systems thinker, right? How can we
Right.
adjust systems so that more classrooms are as effective as the most effective classroom teacher? Because in every school we have we have a whole range of teachers. We have a few highly effective teachers that just do their work. They're not interested in teaching other teachers. They just keep their head down and they're highly effective. So I want to think through a systems approach, like how do we get every teacher to be that top rated, most effective teacher? And so I stayed in administration from that very first year where I had a great mentor, David Lyons of mine, transitioned to be added to another middle school for 2 years, did some turnaround work there, and then was then pushed to the high school because the turnaround work was so powerful at the middle school that, all right, we need a high school principal. I'm an elementary school teacher, right?
Right.
But they needed someone who had an understanding of systems, who looked at data, and who had very clear decision-making skills around how to move a system. And so doing that for 3 years was a lot of really hard work. I was a young man. I woke up early. I left late. I did a lot of work on the weekends, but burnt myself out turning a second school around in a row. And so my
It's a
plan was
lot
to
of work.
go back to grad school and then be a superintendent. That was my plan. But I went to grad school, and that was a very eye-opening experience of just about the racism in higher education. It's so profound that I chose to become a professor because of that. because they needed a different voice in the academia ranks. And so
Hmm.
for 4.5 years, I did research, I taught, I did my TED Talk, I wrote my book then for another voice in educational leadership around anti-racism. And at the same time, the book became popular and folks wanted some more work. And that's when I founded the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute 4 years ago. And that's what we do full time. We work with education-based organizations, schools, school districts, county school districts, state departments, and nonprofit organizations all across the country, and even some globally. And I really love the work. It's hard work, but it's very meaningful work. And I'm interested from you, like, how did you get into the work? Like, what was your entryway? What made you feel like this was the path?
Yeah, so similar to you, it was really looking at the whole systemic structure of education and recognizing that the system that we operate in, whether it's K 12 or higher ed, they were all created in the 1800s, mostly by white men to teach white boys taught by white men. And so systemically, the systems that we operate in, they were never designed to be equitable. They were never designed to be diverse because they were created for pretty much a homogeneous group of men and boys to teach. And so when I started to recognize some of the racial issues and some of the disparities between who is achieving, and people would say, well, yes, of course, white kids are at the top and kids of color at the bottom because that's how the system was designed. So it's getting the outcomes that it was created for. And so looking at it as well from this idea of how do I impact systems, my friends, I put it in quotes, and you'll hear why in a minute, but my friends told me that if you want to change the educational system, then you need to be a school board member. So, which I thought was an interesting idea to think about how do you change a system from a political perspective. So, I ran for the school board here in Boulder in 1997, and I served on the board for 6 years, and I was the president of the board for a couple years, really working hard to see could you change the system from a political perspective. And I will tell you that my experience was you cannot, because the politics are so entrenched that people are, for the most part, are unwilling to give up power and the privilege that they have to do the things that need to be done. Even the hierarchical structure was designed to create a system where those white men remain in power and everything goes down. And unless you have privilege, you never get to the top. So that was my first attempt, really looking at the system. And it was an interesting 6 years because I served on the statewide school board association board of directors. I chaired the school board members of color across the state group, and so we were really working hard on these systemic changes, and it was little pockets of it. And even when I was on the board, we spent probably, I don't know, $3 or $5 million putting teachers through these cohorts of culturally responsive practices. And I wasn't really seeing a change in the classroom. So one year I went to the teachers and I said, well, tell me about this experience. And to a person, they would say, it was the greatest thing I ever went through. I learned so much about myself. Not one of them, though, told me, and here's how it impacted my instructional practices, or here's how it impacted how I see my students differently, or how I do behavioral expectations in my classroom. So to me, it was a waste of millions of dollars because it didn't affect our children. So I went through that and I stopped doing that for a while. And then I found an opening in Denver Public Schools, which is the largest school district in our state. It's about 80,000 kids. And they were hiring for a position called the Director of Equity and Inclusion. I basically created and named my own position. So then I said, okay, well, let me see if you can change the system from within. So that was I spent almost 12 years in Denver Public Schools as an administrator. And so in doing that, I was able to facilitate lots of leadership development work, lots of what we call DEI work, and really supporting people. And the most interesting part of it was all leadership driven. The leaders who really understood it and bought into it were the ones who had success at their schools, and the other ones didn't. And it was never messaged through the district about the importance of it. So at the time, we had a white male superintendent, wealthy, who could talk about his privilege as a white male and yet couldn't articulate how it's impacting what's happening in education. So I thought that was interesting also. And so while it affected certain schools, it didn't change the whole systemic structure. And we had these great initiatives like Black Boys Initiatives and the Latino Boys Initiative, but I could never understand why don't we just come together and create, a student outcome initiative, because it's almost like this bifurcated thinking that a black child and a brown child are going through completely different experiences. And from looking at a system that is divided and not set up for either one of those groups, they're both having a similar negative experience. And so that's kind of where I started doing this work, and started to really start to think about, what is the answer. And then of course this work has evolved to now it's, anti-racist work, DEI work. It's some of it's really performative, and some of it is actually having an impact. And I still wonder, even as a practitioner, what's the impact that I'm having, and is it sustainable and systemic in terms of changing the culture of the organizations I'm working with.
Wow, wow. No, I appreciate that. So you got into you're a board member who supported system-wide PD around culturally responsive teaching. You
Yep.
then moved on to be the DEI person of the district. I assume you were the district DEI
Yeah.
person, right?
Yeah. So I
Um,
basically had a team of people, and our role was creating bias awareness trainings and really looking at how stereotypes and judgments and those things impact. And while people resonated with it, the ability to make shifts in their schools was so leader dependent that, you know, with 200 schools, it was never really systematized.
mm. And so what do you think, I have my perceptions, right, about
Yeah.
why it happened. But, in retrospect, when you're thinking through, because I know I do it at the school level, because I was a leader who I didn't call it anti-racism at the time because I'm a data guy, right? We just looked at
Right.
gaps, gaps
Yep.
in attendance, gaps in achievement, gaps in discipline, gaps in special ed referrals. We look at the gaps and we developed systems to alleviate those gaps. That's anti-racism. But I didn't call it that at the time because it's very data driven and leadership focused because I had expectations and I held folks accountable, right? We're going to make it happen,
Right.
right? So why do you believe, like in such a large system, what would be, well, what worked about it, what didn't work, and how, if you had to go back, would you do it differently this time?
Well, people would say, "Oh, it's such a big system," and I don't think it's the size that mattered. It was the messaging. And at the time, I wasn't a part of the cabinet, so that's one thing that I would insist on, that this position be a part of the cabinet, because if you can't drive the decisions at the cabinet level, then I had to depend on my boss to take my messages and deliver them with the same intensity that I would. And of course, that never happened.
Right.
So that would be one piece, is that if it's not a cabinet level or a C-suite position, then the impact is less, because there's no accountability to those upper level leaders to actually do the work themselves and change. Because people would ask me, so all this work that you're asking us to do, has the superintendent and the cabinet done it? And I said, well, I'll answer it this way. In 6 years, I've had about 4 hours with them. So the answer is no. So that would be one thing. The other piece is the messaging. So it really came up. We had these equity boot camps that I did 3 or 4 times a year that were really powerful, where we get a couple hundred people in the room, from students to community members to teachers, administrators, even some of our nonprofit support groups. And we'd spend the morning um, really looking at an issue like, why are our students of color not achieving at the same level as white students? And then we'd spend the afternoon creating these action steps. And the superintendent came to one of them and talked about all of the equity work and why it's so important and how we're going to use it to change. And then when he was done, he was talking to a teacher, and I was standing there, and she said, that was a really great message that you shared, but that's not what I hear in my building.
Mm,
That's not what I'm told. So the messaging wasn't the same from the top by the time it got filtered through. And then in this particular district, there was this middle level of folks that were these community superintendents. And so the message would come from the superintendent to these community folks who then had 8 or 9 networks. And then they would message it the way that they felt it was important. And they would actually
mm,
tell schools that I had set up a lot of work with around the equity outcomes. Well, that's really great, but you need to focus on Common Core and standards. So you can't do the equity work, as if Common Core and standards are devoid of this conversation.
right.
So I think that's the piece that is really important too, is that consistent messaging. And then getting all the leaders in the same room to have a workshop or an afternoon together where we can talk about it from the same lens and have them all hear the same message from a consistent perspective. I think those are probably the 3 things. So being on the cabinet, making sure the message is consistent from the top down, and then getting the leadership team together, the leadership in the district together to have the same experience with the same level of outcomes and push to say this is how it should systemically impact your school or your department to make a change. Because I was pretty fortunate. I got to work in both the academic side and the operational side of the house. So having conversations with our procurement folks around, are you using diverse vendors? How are you attracting them? And of course, that was a great conversation because the white project managers would go right to, are you calling me a racist?
Mm,
No, actually, I'm asking you why you think that a contractor of color is less qualified than a white contractor. That's the conversation. So those are some of the things, and I would probably shift the conversations into things just like what I shared, um, that that connect it more to us as human beings than this amorphous system that people kind of get lost in. So
yeah. Now you said a couple of really, profound things with describing what would you do differently. I think it's good for DEI practitioners that, cabinet being on the cabinet and being a member of those in power is absolutely important. You don't pocket you in HR as a director somewhere with no
yeah,
power, no budget, and no levels that hold people accountable. And with optional participation, that is a recipe for disaster, right? But you also said when you approached the procurement specialist and you said that, are you calling me a racist? That's an interesting question that I've been toying around the different answers, right? Because this comes up all the time, right?
yeah,
We work with enough people that, are you calling me racist? Are you calling us racist? And I was like, and I've tried out a number of responses, and sometimes like, yeah, yeah, I am calling you racist. Okay, so what now, right? Like, you probably have a lot of racist tendencies. What type of neighborhood did you choose to live in? Where did you choose to send your kids to school, right? Do you actively avoid black and brown communities? And all those answers are yes. So I think that racism has something to do with it. But that doesn't equate to being a bad person. But in order to excavate our racism, we have to own it. Um, but, how do you deal with that? Because our knee-jerk response is no, because I don't want to hurt your feelings. But there's
right,
probably some racism in there, right? So what are your
yeah.
thoughts?
Well, I mean, for me, I approach it as like, well, let's talk about what are the impacts of race? What have they been in your life? Like, how do you interact with somebody who's a different race than you? Do you seek out people who are black or brown? Because race is just a color. Within all our races, there's a whole variety of ethnicities and cultural lived experiences, and so sometimes too, what I'll do is, Tracy, is I'll say, well, that's really interesting. Why do you think that based on what I said that you're being called a racist? Why would you go there?
Hmm.
That's probably my biggest go-to question now. I just turn it back around and say, that's really interesting. Did you actually hear me call you a racist? Well, no. I said, okay, So all I said was, and I'll repeat what I said about how can you sit here and tell me that you think there's no qualified subcontractors of color, and then ask them to talk about the impacts of race. And so when I turn it back around and say, why would you go there? It kind of puts the conversation back onto them because now they have to think about it. And they may not have an answer, and yet it shifts it. And if there's enough people in the room, somebody else might bring something up. So I found being inquisitive is a really great strategy because there are times when I will say, yeah, race does play a role. It's pretty evident in the data that I'm looking at that there's something here that's being impacted by race. So what is it? And I do want to get to that. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that all of us run the propensity of interacting with a person or a group and maybe having a blind spot about the role that race plays. But I
Yeah, and I,
think
I
to
wonder
answer
if,
your question, the biggest part is like, can I put it back onto them by asking them a question about how they heard that?
yeah, and two things like with that, like where do you hope they go? So you hope they have some adaptive mind shift. So be inquisitive, put it back on them. What do you hope they take away from that conversation? That okay, well, I guess he wasn't calling me a racist because maybe that's what they'll get to. That oh, I don't have an issue. He's just talking about somebody else. He's not talking about me because they might get there. But I think you're hoping they
Yeah.
get to someplace different.
Well, I'm hoping they get to realizing that race plays a role and we need to talk about it. Like, we just need to talk about it instead of dancing around it or acting like it's not real. I mean, when we look at black boys who are over referred to discipline across this country at 6 times the rate of white boys for exactly the same disruptive or disrespectful behavior, the only difference is their race. And we're just not talking about white teachers. Like, I've worked with black and brown teachers who have that same fear of that same group of boys and treat them differently. And so ultimately, I think for me, I want to get to let's have that conversation. Let's have a real conversation about the racial impacts of what we're doing in education or in business, and how is it impacting us?
Yeah, yeah, and the structural and systemic racism, that's what we do as well, right? It's baked into the system. The system is not, like you said in the beginning, it's not designed to sort of address sort of the intrinsic biases that people bring into the system, right? That then
Right.
control the ways in which it functions towards people of color. And I had this question about a month ago, and I hadn't dealt with it in a while. I read Ibram Kennedy's book, maybe a couple of years ago, right? He's defining, how to be an anti-racist, who's a racist, who's not a racist.
Yeah.
And a question was asked me from a doctoral student that I was a guest speaker in was like, how do you define racist? Like who to you in your mind is a racist? That's really something I'm really wrestling with. And I'll share my answer, but I want to hear your perspective on how you would answer a question like that. Like, how do you define racism and who is? Because she chooses like some people say that white people can only be racist, but I believe
Right.
everyone can be racist. And
Yeah.
so, how do you define it? So, how would you handle that question?
Well, I'm going to go back. Dr. John Powell, who's part of the Haas Institute in Berkeley. I love his work. He does a lot of work on other and belonging. I use his definition because his definition is basically that racism is when someone from one racial group thinks that they're better than another racial group, which leads to divisiveness and animosity and basically marginalizing the group that they think is less than or inferior. So, from that perspective, even though I don't identify as white, I can exhibit racism when I believe that I'm better than a white person or a black person. And so now it doesn't negate the power and privilege conversation. That's a whole nother element that we can talk about. I like the simplicity of his approach though, because it doesn't just say that only white people can be racist. So that's my approach. And I've used it in various parts of the country, and it causes people to think and in some cases want to go a little bit deeper into what that means or even how they've experienced people who are racially different from them in their own lives, which is part of my goal in this work is to keep people engaged in the conversation, knowing that it's going to be emotional, know that it's going to be challenging, knowing that people will get angry or upset or exhibit all those behaviors. I don't want to negate any of that. And I still want to keep them in the conversation. So I don't want them to get so emotionally debilitated that they say, I'm never talking about this again.
No, I hear you. Yeah, that sort of zone of possible development, right? You want to get to the
Yeah.
place where they can do with help, not push them to the outer rink where they're just like, I'm disengaged, right?
Freaking
And
out.
I'm
I'm
not
going to
coming back,
run.
right? And be like, Bill said this, he's called me a racist, and I've had that because it's a fine line to walk, especially
Yeah.
in a large group of individuals, because they're all along the spectrum of racial identity development, right?
Right.
And we got to cater to the lowest rung, right, to make
Right.
sure that they can stay in the conversation without acquiescing to white fragility. Because the only way to
Yeah.
get better at race talk is actually to be emotionally uncomfortable. That's why it's so hard. So we
Right.
have to get them to an emotional space to experience the discomfort, like you say, with being able to practice that discomfort without disengaging,
Yeah. And
right?
I think, I had this conversation earlier about how a lot of practitioners don't know how to really handle that emotionality that's needed to make the shifts. And so they can bring it up, but then how do you work people through it? Like when there's somebody who's really angry and exhibits it, and yet how do you use that as a way to say, what did y'all just hear from this gentleman who all you saw was anger, but did you actually hear what he was saying? Because there was a lot to that. I mean, I did a workshop once where it was in a neighborhood that was being gentrified, and the homes were being sold that were predominantly Latino families who had been there for 40 or 50 years, and they were slowly being replaced by affluent white families building $1 million home next to $100,000 bungalow. And we had a community meeting that one of the churches sponsored, and um, there was some Latino families in there, and there was this one gentleman who came in, and man, I tell you, he was hot. He
Mm-hmm.
was ready to go, and he did. He just, when we basically had people talk about what brought him in, he just went off, and he was yelling, and he was angry, and he was emotionally charged, and he was talking about all you white people in the room and how you're making it so my parents can't even afford the taxes on their homes, and when I'm outside working on my yard, you come over and ask me if I can come over and landscape your yard, not realizing that I've owned this house for 30 years. And I am pissed off. And all these people, they're looking at me and they're looking at him. And I just let him go because I knew that this was something they needed to feel, like not just hear, they needed to feel it. And when he went off, it was a good 3 or 4 minutes before he was finally spent. And and I asked people in the room, like, what are you feeling right now? And they expressed, upset and anger. And I'm like, okay, so what you're experiencing right here in this 10 minutes that this gentleman has expressed his emotion is his lived experience almost every day.
Yes.
So that's what we're here to talk about. And then we got into a larger circle. And of course, I drew the line when he called one of the participants the B word. I said, no, that's a little over the top. So I had to put some parameters around it that you're not going to denigrate other people. Like bringing your own emotion, that's all fair and that's fine. And so that's that emotionality. Or the white guy who comes in and says, "Is this another one of these workshops where I'm going to be called a racist just because I'm white?" Like that's another question. I'm curious how you respond to that one. I'm sure you've heard it before.
Yeah, like let's get that out the way. Hey, racist, welcome. Have a seat. Humor. I found humor more and more to be something that disarms the emotionality, right? Because to get into that space where folks are uncomfortable, to use some humor, like they come in, yeah, yeah, and I've had that. They'll come and sit back, well, you're just gonna call because I'm the white guy, I'm the racist one. I was like, oh, welcome, racist. We got it out the way. All right, how did that feel? Okay, we got it out the way. Don't leave. You'll be all right by the time you get them laughing a little bit, right? Sort of
Right.
because racism is not funny, but it's very emotionally laden. And when you're thinking about because it's interesting, right? When what looks like a calm white audience is listening to a person of color express their sort of lived experience, which is enraging because it's an everyday experience, right?
Right.
Because we experience just the sort of um, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very specific word. The entitlement of whiteness that's very violent and with a calm face,
Right.
right? It's such entitlement to our space, to being able to openly discriminate, to gentrify a neighborhood. Like, I don't know what the problem is, right?
Right.
We love all of our neighbors. Mind you, we're building houses in these neighborhoods, knowing very well that the intent is to drive up the housing prices to drive you out, to make it white. We know how
Right.
this works, right? And that's
Yeah.
very violent. You know, that violence in using white supremacy as power in a historical sense is very violent. And the person of color who comes in looks like the one who's, as they say, dysregulated. But
Right.
those ones who
Right.
are already imparting violence with a calm face are the whites in the room. And to make that connection, right, as you say, well, this is, this is if you're feeling, frustrated and angry by the way he expressed himself, this is how he feels every day. But how do you get them to really ingest that when they don't see themselves as imparting violence?
Yeah. That's hard. I mean, that is the challenging part of this work, I think, is how you can effectively hold a mirror up and get people to look at the impacts that they're having, because I think they want to just focus on the intent, and of course the intent is always flowery and loving and kind, but yet the impact that this gentleman saw and experienced every day was demeaning and dehumanizing, and was like taking away his whole culture because they didn't want to keep the artifacts in the neighborhood, the art and things like that, because now they're in the way of our building. And so I think that's the challenge of, once they're emotionally awake, how how do how do we as practitioners skillfully get them to own the impact, not just like, well, I didn't intend to do that. Well, great. Like, but the impact is what you just experienced this gentleman saying. So what's your role in that? And I think that's the most challenging part, is to get people who think they're innocent bystanders to realize that no, you're playing a pretty real role in this emotionality that you're just experiencing from this man of color whose life is completely changed because of the choices that you're making. And
Right.
so that's why I think that this work is so challenging, because it's not just a dashboard that we're looking at. It's not just an assessment that we can go to and say, here's what it looks like in your neighborhood. It's that unpacking piece that's the real work, I think, in moving the needle on some of these conversations. And then, I mean, we haven't even talked about the whole political climate that we're operating in today either, which is adding a whole nother element to this work and to the decisions that organizations are making right now too.
Yeah, no, we should definitely talk about that. And I wanted to sort of revisit that question about before you transition to the political nature of what's coming. Like what has been, it's not even it's been like this for centuries, right? It's just
Yeah,
that
it's
we've
not really that
been
it's coming. It's just,
it's just sort of in the court of public opinion right now, right?
yeah,
Amongst the whites, right? People of color,
yeah,
we've always done known this, right?
yeah,
But when you're talking about the Latino man who's being pushed out, whose space is being gentrified by these white folks who are exhibiting this very real structural racism because they're in positions of power to be able to deploy their economic stature to
right,
push poor black and brown people out of their neighborhood. And so that's why when I was answering that student, going back to the student that was in that doctoral class about defining racism, and I am more akin to Dr. Joy DeGroy's definition, and she does it so eloquently. She has a couple clips online about having folks describe, like, all right, describe what black racism looks like. Right, to room full of white people. What does black racism look like? Right, all they're like,
right,
oh, calling me cracker, you know, being mean because we're white, making fun of us because we smell like wet dogs, all these like pejorative tropes, right, about what black racism look like, right, towards
right,
white people. And it's like, all right, Now they got those all out. Okay, what does white racism look like towards black people? They're like, well, lack of access to adequate health care, lack of access to adequate schools, redlining,
Yep.
mass incarceration, And she's like, so we have to understand the differences in how we use the term racism. Like racism is the ability to discriminate based in your position in power. You can actually affect the lives of entire groups of people of color by moving as a collective of white people. So you have the power to be racist and enact racism and to construct systemic racism. Black and brown people, we don't have the power and stature in society to enact racism in any way to affect an entire group. We can be mean. We can be prejudiced,
Right.
right?
Right.
We can be
Right.
biased, right? So when we're
Right.
talking about the gradations of racism, that when we're talking about racism, it's the racially dominant group that has the power to be racist and enact structural racism. And black and brown, we can be prejudiced, we can be biased, but we do not
Hmm.
have the capacity to actually affect the trajectory of a white community because we just
Hmm.
simply don't have the societal power to do so.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's where I am right now in my journey around understanding the dynamics of when we use racism. But I don't think we split hairs because it really doesn't matter in the end. If we're focused on outcomes, the outcomes are the outcomes,
Right.
right? We don't
Right.
need to go out there on a witch hunt looking for racists. That doesn't matter.
Right. And to what degree the harm is the harm and the hurt that it's caused is real, whether it's around power and privilege or just looking at somebody from a racially different lens and saying you're the other. I mean, the outcome is, I think, is what I'm hearing you say, is not dissimilar in that the way that it affects a whole group of people. It's just that as a person of color, I couldn't get together with my other friends of color and affect a whole white group of people because I don't have the power to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's what I'm likening to right now. And so that the political climate, I mean, whew, it's been there. It's been there. And
It's
so, what's your
always
take
been
on
there.
it? Yeah, what's
I
your take
know.
on what has happened, right? We got sort of post George Floyd, you know, even pre George Floyd. We have to think
Yeah.
about like how long we've been in sort of this stasis ish
Well,
since
what was
1965,
the black guy in L.A. who got beat up? King. I forget his first name.
Yeah, Rodney King. That was in the
Rodney
80s, and we're
King.
like we're like oh
Like
we're like
when
oh
was that? That was like in the 60s and 70s. It's like so we all saw that on national television, and I think that I don't know. It's interesting because even the conversation we just had, the um, more conservative pundits are wrapping that around critical race theory and how we can't talk about that because from their lens, like the way I see it is people are just creating narratives that fit whatever it is that they want it to say. Because I've read critical race theory and nowhere does it say and by the way, all white people are racist. It doesn't say
right.
that. It talks about the systemic structures of racism, redlining, and all these other things that we've talked about. And yet the political structure is then taking it to say, well, it's bad because it's labeling all white people as racist. And so this whole political climate and our incoming president when he was the past president and I read his executive order and I will say there's one place where I agreed upon it, and that's where he talked about a number of practitioners who are doing more harm than good
Mm,
because they're basically labeling all white people as racist. And I've seen that where a practitioner comes in and tells everybody you're the problem because you're white and so now they're using that as fodder to say this is what's wrong with DEI work. And when the affirmative action and hiring processes went to the Supreme Court, of course that changed everything because now it's codified in law that you can't use race as a factor, and yet race is a factor. And so then I mean, let's, Rodney King, it didn't really change the systemic structure. George Floyd, right after George Floyd, majority of groups hired a DEI person and created an equity statement. And
right.
today, even before this heavy duty politicization, they've been letting them go because they've not been effective. And I think some of that is that nobody really defined what being an effective DEI strategist or practitioner looks like what are the outcomes that we're really striving for. And I think there's so much fear around how we're going to be, how this is going to play out on the internet, that people are pulling back also from a business perspective, even from a practitioner perspective. People are so worried about being canceled, so you have all these elements that are now creating fear. And then you have a company like Costco who says, well, we're not budging. And so people say, well, I renewed my Costco membership. And I'm thinking, I wonder what's the difference that's going to make in terms of that. Or a McDonald's who says, we're not doing this level of DEI work. And as I've read about it, they're not changing some of their HR practices that create more diversity. There's just some of the things that they've stopped doing. And in some cases, I think we can be our own worst enemy because we take something and then put it on LinkedIn or Facebook as here's how bad this company is, rather than looking at the whole thing. So it's just a cluster really right now. And I think one benefit it could have is just weeding out DEI practitioners who are doing more harm than good, or not really impacting what needs to be done, which is like, I don't think as a group we've ever had that conversation about what's the objective of our work. Like if we're there, what the hell does it look like so that's an interesting part of this whole approach. And now we're almost in a position where we have to talk about it because you have this political narrative. And so part of what I want to do these days is to disrupt that political narrative with something else. Not to say that everything I say or you say is correct, but just to say, let's create a different narrative around it. Because, either you drive the message or the message drives you. And I think right now we're being driven by the message versus creating a new narrative around the beauty of this work and the connections that it could have and the ways that it could change how we see each other. So I'll stop
Yeah,
there, 'cause I know you
yeah,
have an
no,
opinion on
no,
this
I,
too.
no, I'm in absolute agreement that I don't know about harm than good. I'm thinking just be neutral and ineffective. That's what more of what I've seen. That's why our institute is so. That's why we are effective at what we do, right? Because we start with outcomes. Like, what is the purpose? That's the first question with a
Right,
partner. It's like, what are you seeking to achieve? Right? If it's like, well, just come and give a talk and, share your work. I'm like, no, that's probably causing more harm than good. Meaning that you can say that you're about equity. You can say you're about anti-racism because you had me come. You bought my book,
right,
right? You went through the institute. And so you're actually changing no systemic practices at all, except to say like, oh, we are on the side of good. And I
right,
argue that that's more harm than good because we're providing cover for folks who aren't invested in the work.
right.
And
Because then
so,
they'll say, "Well, I went through Bill's workshops, or I went through Tracy's institute, and we're good. They gave us this check mark."
and they'll have the speak. They'll have the talk. What I call word
Yeah,
salad. Yeah, we prepare them with the word salad to
right.
use to say, a lot of like high acuity folks who are great with the word salad, who have the buzzwords. You can talk about the
Yeah,
structures. This is what we're doing. We're doing culture responsive teaching over here. We're doing restorative practice over here. Tracy's anti-racism over here. I'm like, all right, I don't care about any of that. What are your
right.
outcomes?
Right.
What has
What
this
and
done
that's
for
why
students?
that's right. What's the ultimate objective when you're there? What's happening that's different than what we're starting with?
And I think that's an ongoing conference for practitioners. That's what we need to come together and have those hard conversations with one another, not to point each other out like you're not doing the work, you're not doing the work, but as a collective, it doesn't matter what we call it. I call us the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute specifically because, according to me, anti-racism is making sure that we are purposely opposing racism and validating it's actually happening, right? But you can call
Mhm.
my institute the Brick Wall Institute. It doesn't matter. The point is
Right.
that the problems don't change. The gaps don't
Right.
disappear because the political realm says we can't say equity.
Right.
They're still there. So
Yeah.
verbiage and fighting over splitting hairs over what we call things, I think, is a road to nowhere because it doesn't change the nature of the outcomes, and it also makes work like ours an easy target,
Yeah.
right? And
Because it
so, and when
says
we talk about getting into
anti-racist or whatever.
yeah, in the
What-
political realm, it makes it easy fodder, right? If we're so wedded to being this anti-racism that if we can't work in a state because they won't allow us to be known as the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute, that's on our part because the problems are still there.
Right.
And so in the political realm, we don't have to call it, any sort of specific verbiage. We'd have to define, I think, starting with defining the problem and
Yeah.
then develop a solution. And if race is involved in that, we have to develop strategies and processes for having folks change their practice to address that specifically, even if we don't use the verbiage. And that's,
And I completely agree with that because I've worked in some of these conservative states that have anti-CRT legislation, and I actually work with the people who are bringing me in, and I say, okay, so what if we call it this? Well, let's not call it that. Let's call it othering and belonging or whatever. And guess what? I still have conversations with them about race. I still
mhm,
have conversations with them about biases and judgments and what are the outcomes that you're looking for. And I think some practitioners are saying, well, no, I'm not going to change my language. And I'm like, okay, then how effective will you actually be? Because your audience is going to shrink, especially once the new administration comes in, because they're going to double down on what's already started. And so how do we, because I think to your point, we spend more time talking about the language versus the outcomes. Like all I care about are the outcomes. Like I want to live on a street where I can have diverse neighbors and not be afraid to talk to them or not be afraid to engage with them or live in fear that they will do something to me because I'm different from them. That's an outcome. Now the way that I get there is going to be as really diverse and could be talking through impacts of race, or am I being anti-racist or am I being racist, or how do I look at gender or age or any of these other pieces that play a role in how we see each other. So even expanding it to an identity conversation, I think is more effective in terms of looking at outcomes than just saying, no, I'm going to call it this and I don't care what people say.
right. And I think it doesn't belong in the political sphere. It is a
No.
humanitarian effort. It's humanitarian. Right? We get into these ideological arguments, like you say, those who come in like you're the problem, you're the racist. You have to and ingest your racism, and you're like you're not bad. Like this is the nature of how you've been raised. You're a fish in water, and you have breathed this in your entire life, right? And now
Mm-hmm.
when you see these outcomes in your classroom that are disparate, it's because it's what you've learned. It's not because you're a bad person, right? But it's also because in order to find a way to resolution, we have to acknowledge and accept that we've ingested a lot of these racial biases. And so
Right.
saying it to the end of like humanitarianism rather than excuse me, this political epistemology or political ideology is where we have to get to. And I also
Yeah.
enjoy this political climate. Like folks look at me crazy when I'm like, "You enjoy this? Like what? This is crazy." There's been no period of time outside of when folks of color, that's Native Americans, that's Latinos, that's Black folks, that's Asian Americans, leading a liberation movement on their behalf hasn't been a source of public in the public opinion, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
white society commenting on these people seeking for liberation. But what I'm
Right.
finding now is these are whites fighting against whites, right? Around this
Right.
idea of anti-racism. And I think that
Yeah.
is progress, right? That's what needs to happen. This is the uncomfortable part of coming to a better resolution around how we progress as a country, going to this very, very difficult stage of like we have to reconcile with our roots, right? And we
Yeah.
have these two sides clashing, and this is not a clash of people of color. It's a clash of white people, right? I'm
Well,
like,
that's true.
this is awesome that we're going through this very uncomfortable period. We don't know how long it's going to take, but as long as it's a part of the discourse, that whites who are in power are talking to whites who are in power about this idea of anti-racism, that's a marker
Yeah.
of progress. I don't know how you feel about that.
I mean, I think that's true. I don't. I mean, I'm just I'm of the mind that if the conversation's happening, then we can move somewhere. If the conversation's not happening, I mean, for you and I, this has been a conversation my whole life. It's not just started. But for white people, especially in power today, you have just what you described, this group that says, yes, we need to do this, and this group that says, no. I don't know if either one of them truly understand the
Right.
reason why, to be honest, because it's politically driven. Like to them, that's their why. Well, because I'm a Democrat, or because I'm Republican, or because I'm liberal or conservative or independent, or whatever the hell they call themselves. And so I think that uh, the beauty of this time is that it's elevating the conversation to a place where it's never been before, because we've been doing it mostly within organizations, or within a group of people, and it's been mainstreamed now. So that's why I say it would be great for us to get together a group of practitioners and actually have a conversation about what are the outcomes, because I think if we're not outcome oriented, then we're giving all these mixed messages to people, or we're creating these mixed levels of trust in the work because of the way that it's being presented, from more of a process versus process and outcome oriented, because you have to have processes to shift systemic structures and disrupt them. You also have to have, which is one of the things that DPS didn't have when I was the director of equity inclusion, is we didn't have consistent outcomes that I could go to every school and say, here's the outcome, whether it was the predominantly more white school in the southeast part of Denver, or the predominantly black school in the northwest part of Denver. And so that's a big piece, I think, and in our work that we don't often. I've never been to a conference where we've just talked about outcomes from a real perspective. It's always
Yeah.
about, here's workshops, and there's like 20 workshops, and there are literally 20 different approaches to anti-racism or DEI work. And it's typically been people selling stuff. Like, I'm
Yeah.
tired of going to conferences where people want to sell me their stuff. It's like, let's let's talk about how we're going to message this and talk about it and create some consistent outcomes. So regardless of whether we're talking about it in Kentucky or Colorado or Oregon, that the practitioners can at least land on some similar outcomes. If we're there, what does there look like?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I will come to the conference, Bill. If you convene it, I will be there. I will participate, right? And I will pay full room and board and travel. I will pay to come to this conference because it's important. And I don't think I'm right. I've learned so much from so many
Yeah,
people. I pick things up
yeah,
all the time. When I go to conferences, I go to all these different DEI, sessions, and I pick things up, right? And I add it to my
yeah,
repertoire how
right.
to seek outcomes. And I think it's uber important for us to get there because what happens often is that folks go DEI, consultant shopping, right? Who's the one
Yes,
that's closest to what we already do? They actually won't make us do anything, but they're
right.
entertaining. So you become
Yeah,
like stage performers, right?
that's right. And that's what people have told me. Well, we got this guy because he was really funny. Like, great. Did you like have any results, or have things, are things sustainable? And they can't even tell me that, but they sure had a good time.
Loved
So
it. And yeah, especially the
yeah,
humor. So I have one more question for you because I know our time is running low. And this
yeah,
is something that I'm currently wrestling. I'm writing a second book right now. I'm on
okay,
chapter 9 right now. Um, it's a perennial problem. It's a perennial problem that can anyone, we're not just talking about white people, but predominantly white people, but even people of color, just be anti-racist at work, right? Because
mm,
what has been the sort of like I'm coming to work. The will and want of the leadership says we're going to be an anti-racist organization. I have to do these things. I have to think deeply about these, but only at work, right? When I go home, I go back to my enclave, and we talk about white folks, my white enclave, where I live with predominantly white people. I send my kids to white schools. I actively avoid black and brown communities. I hire folks, when I can, that look like me, that think like me. I'm not trying to hire some brown person who's like this radical anti-racist. And so all these realms of like preserving white supremacy in our personal lives, can I then come to work and be an anti-racist?
That's a really good question. And I think I'm going to answer it from a humanistic approach
Mm,
and say, I don't believe that's possible because I don't know how you take a life's work of, or a life's worth of doing things in a certain way and having your little group who reflects you and looks like you, and then kind of like take that off when you go to the office and leave it outside. And now you are this anti racist warrior who's going to look at everybody through a different lens. Because I think we, as human beings, we take those parts of ourselves. It's like the people who say, I don't come to work to be personal, I'm just here to do a job.
right.
And I'm like, really? So what do? Do you like take your heart out and leave it outside when you come to work? Because this is our profession. Our intellect is where we keep what we do and what our role is. And our heart is where we are personal and connecting. So I haven't figured out how to separate my heart from my head and go into a place of business and just be professional. And I think it's, I mean, it would be a really great conversation as well. Personally, I don't think it's possible for me to just be in my little enclave with people who look like me all day long and then go to work and say, now I want to be around everybody. And for me, I guess I'll say, as a brown person, like I seek that out in my personal and professional life. So I haven't figured out. I don't think it's possible. I guess it's the bottom line to be my segregated self is how I'll frame it at home, and then go to work and then be an inclusive person. Because I think it's too much of a brain. I think it's too much of a brain shift and a behavioral shift that I don't think it's possible. So
Mm, mm.
that's how I would
Yeah.
answer it. Where are you landing with that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's become more and more a part of like coming into focus, right? Because we're brought in the workspace. We're not brought
Right,
in the community space, right? Like
right,
me, as in my family, we want. I'm not a family therapist on how to help a family be more racially equitable, right? I want every
right.
kid to grow up being racially literate, whether you're a kid of color, whether you're a white kid.
Yeah,
Racial literacy
absolutely.
is essential, right?
Yeah,
But I know it's woefully neglectful in white families often. We just don't talk about race. It's just
right.
not a thing, right?
Yeah,
Um, and the more and more I see individuals who take this home, and that's what I'm getting at. The more that the folks ingest it in work and take it home, and having the conversation with their children, having the conversation with the amount of children who are educating parents is amazing.
yeah,
I just had a client take it home. She took it home to her son. She's Japanese American. She was an immigrant here. The racial literacy just wasn't there, right? And went through our institute. Wonderful, wonderful, very nice, right? But had all this racial literacy that just wasn't there. But she was an immigrant who came to the country as an adult. Her son was raised here. And so when
yeah,
she discussed it with him, she's like, Mom, how are you thinking like this? We are Japanese in a white community, right? And went on all the racism that he'd been experiencing. And
uh-huh.
she's like, Oh, I had no idea. And she didn't even know
Yeah,
to ask the question, right? And I had the same thing with with white practitioners who go home and for the first time discuss it with their family, and the children are like, "Dad, where you been? Right? You're a
yeah,
superintendent. You don't know the racism we see every day in the school system where you work. You're our superintendent, and you don't see
right.
this."
Yeah.
Right? And so I think it's amazing the progress that I've seen with folks take the learning that starts at work. That's okay, and then take it home, right?
So
Because
that
that
I
means they're
believe is
ingesting the learning.
possible. That
Yes.
I believe is possible. That we can affect the community by what we do in the workplace. I just don't think it's possible to continue to stay segregated once you've been exposed to it, and have some understanding of what the conversation is and what we're talking about. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's why I think it's so important to do the organizational work, is because otherwise people just go back to their all white, all black, all brown communities and never have can make a choice of whether they interact with people who are different from them. In
Yeah.
the workplace, it's just part of the diversity of the workplace that's where we can expose them to it. And I've had white men, predominantly white workspaces, who like have told me the great conversations they had when they went home and started to talk to their wives or their kids about biases or judgments or stereotypes, because now they had the language to be able to do it.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the question because folks try to keep it at work, right? And I think that is a recipe for just it remaining. Maybe you reach some extent of racial identity development, or maybe it's too much of a sort of a stretch that once the training's over, you just go right back to the way you've been,
Yeah.
right? That I don't think it's you're able to keep it separated. I'm gonna do this at work, but never talk about my personal life,
Right.
right? You got to bring it home. Got to make it a part of yourself, right?
Yeah.
And the most successful folks who have made a transition to being less reactive and less emotional and less like, oh, are you calling me racist? Is the ones who take it home and make it a part
Yeah.
of their lives. You know,
Because then they have the language to be able to talk about it. They've been made aware that you're not a shameful or a bad person because you do this. And now it's like, okay, well, let me go to somebody I trust, which is what I usually tell them. Find somebody you trust and love and that cares about you when you go home, and share this experience with them, because you can continue your growth and your learning that way. And it's amazing when I follow up with them, the things like what you just shared, where the learning that they're able to take in and the understanding that they didn't have. And I think that's one of the outcomes that would be a awesome way to think about having success in this work. All right. Well, gosh, we're in an hour, my friend, and we could probably talk all day. So,
this is awesome, Bill. This has been awesome. The best podcast I've been on this year. Well, this year, 2025.
okay.
Well, among all this has been like awesome. I appreciate you so much for this conversation.
So,
It's not been work. It's been joy. So I appreciate you.
yeah. So I'm going to let you just like tell people a little bit about your institute, how to find you, how to connect with you, and then I'll close us, and I will really think about this practitioners conference, because I think we're about due for something where we can have some real talk. But
Yeah, or we meet somewhere. We decide that there's a conference we're going to descend on. We're all going to
yeah,
show up there, and we're going to have our own sort of enclave of doing the work. But my
yeah,
book, it's right here. This is my desk copy. It's kind of messed up. See, desk copy. Unconscious
great.
Bias in Schools. It can be found at Harvard Education Press. We run the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute. We work with everything education, right? University, K-12, district, state, education-based organizations around outcomes, right? So if folks have been through the portion of conscious and awareness raising and they're ready to do, we're the organization of do. Like if you want outcomes, if you want to improve the lives of black and brown kids, that's what we do. You can Google me, Tracey Benson, and you can find me because I'm one of the very few. So I appreciate anyone who seeks to do the work and would love to welcome them to work with us.
Awesome. And likewise, this has been one of the best conversations I've had through last year and this year, even though this year is still fresh. So, because I don't often get a chance to chat with other practitioners in a real way, and so I think there's some real value in that. And so again, Tracey Benson has been our guest today, Bill De La Cruz, and as you know, this is what I live and breathe. And like Tracey, my organization is outcome oriented, where we really want to take action, and it's rooted in this framework of awareness, action, accountability, and sustainability. And it's really designed to be able to say, what are we going to do? Not just how are we going to think, but what are we going to do? And how do we impact in education the experiences of Black, brown, and white children, so that everybody becomes racially aware and understands that there's a real conversation here, which again, we could go back into the political piece, but to say that this is a really exciting time, because I think it's driven our conversation to a place where now we can fully engage in it and really dialogue about it. So reach out. The website you can reach out to is De La Cruz Leadership Solutions. And if you're interested in this practitioners conference, shoot me a note. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn, and I'm happy to organize it, because I think that it would be a really awesome way for us to get to know each other. And if you're a practitioner and you want to come on and have an interesting conversation like I've had today with Tracey, let me know. Origination Point Podcast. And Tracey, again, really appreciate it. And I know that we'll be talking more as we move forward through this school year. So
And thank you
peace
so
and
much for having
blessings
me.
to you, and take good care of yourself.
Thank you.